Welcome to Living Mirrors with Dr. James Cook. My guest this week is Sam Gandy. Sam is an ecologist, researcher, and science writer working at the intersection of ecology and psychedelics. He's conducted ecological field research around the world and also has extensive experience of working in the psychedelic field at the Beckley Foundation, Synthesis Institute, and the psychedelic music company Wavepaths. He's currently a project manager with Norfolk Rivers Ecology and a collaborator with the Centre for Psychedelic Research at Imperial College London, with a research interest in the capacity of psychedelics to influence our connection to nature. Today, we talk about the science of how psychedelics can help us rediscover that we are part of nature. Hope you enjoy the conversation. Okay, I'm here with Sam Gandy. Sam, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me, James. It's good to be here. Good to be on.
Yeah, so maybe we can begin with a bit about ecology and psychedelics, because you have this kind of dual background, and a lot of what we're going to talk about is the intersection. I think there's lots of really interesting links, but maybe, tell us a bit about your background in this stuff and how you see them relating to each other.
Sure. So I guess my entry into kind of the ecological field, academically, like I've always had a strong interest in passion for nature, wildlife and the outdoors all my life, pretty much. So I guess I kind of funneled that into academia when I went to university. So I did a master's in entomology, insects, and then I kind of did a PhD in ecology. It's sort of kind of when I was doing my undergrad. At the time, psilocybin mushrooms were legally available in London, on Camden and the High Street. So that's how I kind of first intersected with the psychedelic thing, and I guess my interest was kindled, and I sort of I attended this great biannual conference, Breaking Convention, and sort of met some of the people in the field in the UK and elsewhere. And I think once I sort of had my kind of first experience, a few experiences, I've got the kind of mind that gets interested in things and absorbed in things. So I kind of wanted to know more. I wanted to know more about the science of these things and the research being done, and also the kind of more cultural history and the anthropology and the indigenous usage, all these different sort of interesting kind of areas. So I started to kind of write about psychedelics and give a few presentations. I helped edit a few papers and a few book chapters and stuff like this, and then started kind of writing my own articles and occasional papers. Then I did a stint at the Beckley Foundation, I'm sure you're aware of, like a think tank, charitable trust that kind of instigate funds psychedelic research here in the UK and elsewhere. And around the same time, Robin Carhart-Harris, who formerly headed the Centre for Psychedelic Research in Imperial, he invited me to come on board as a collaborator, as an external collaborator, because he knew of we'd met, and he kind of knew of my interest in nature and ecology. And so I guess it seems sort of the psychedelic thing and ecology seem quite sort of kind of separate things, but I feel like ecology, the science of ecology is all about the study of the interconnection and interdependency of living systems. And obviously it's the kind of detached, objective sort of study, examination of that. And psychedelics, I feel, are kind of relevant to this because they are agents or tools that can kind of facilitate a more direct experiential perception of interconnectedness or interdependency. So they're so I feel like that's sort of why they're quite interesting, and they're sort of the experiential, direct, emotional experiences that's quite important, I feel, because, for instance, so nature connectedness, which is kind of, I guess, linked to ecology, it's the awareness of being part of a larger interconnected living system, our self-identification with nature. And the research that's been done on nature connectedness kind of suggests that scientific knowledge and understanding of nature is not a particularly strong predictor of one's connection to nature. It's much more about your kind of direct experiential emotional connection. So, and obviously this is relevant to psychedelics because this is the domains that they sort of can operate on.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I definitely have heard multiple times, especially amongst people who work in like ecological economics and those kinds of areas, that people who are most interested in affecting ecological change, like in the direction of, protecting the environment, very few, if any, are motivated by kind of cold economic reason. Most people are motivated by a deep love of nature, a deep kind of feeling of connection. And I think that it seems to me, that you were saying that the ecology is the study of kind of interdependence and these kinds of connectivity. And another sentiment I've heard a few times is that ecology is really the most fundamental science. 20th century physics, when you look at, beyond particles, you realize everything is this kind of interdependent web of causation. And that goes all the way up to nature. And we're part of that, right? So then it's almost like with the psychedelic experience, if you're dissolving your sense of the illusion of being fully separate from nature, and then you're getting these kind of metaphysical insights, ecology seems to be the way to understand it at all levels. But yeah, is that, perhaps you could say a bit about how you think about ego dissolution and its role in leading to kind of nature connectedness?
Yeah, sure. And now I think you made an interesting point about, some of the people really active in this area are more motivated by the sort of the deep love and the passion. And I think that's important, and it's related to the environmental crisis or mass extinction event we find ourselves in. And because obviously we've got all this increasing evidence now of the sort of our impact on biodiversity and the climate and other things, and it's not obviously motivating really change at the kind of scale or speed that it needs to, which can kind of, I guess, seem slightly frustrating and exasperating for some. But I see that as partly it's the cold hard facts alone, as important as they are, they're not particularly powerful at actually motivating behavioral change, which seems to be the key thing. The behavior is much more tied to sort of the emotional domain, I would say, and that's the kind of leverage point through which it can be changed. But yeah, in terms of the ego dissolution, so there's a few retrospective survey studies that have looked at sort of psychedelic use, lifetime usage, and nature relatedness, and some of the factors that might predict that. And a few studies have independently found that ego dissolution is a predictor, including one study I was involved in. More recently, though, and I can't really say too much because this study is in sort of preparation, but and it was quite a rigorous study looking at psilocybin usage in a clinical context, both with psychedelic naive people and a clinical sample with major depression, and it had a control group as well. And interestingly, we didn't find any link between ego dissolution and psilocybin and nature connectedness increase, which is a bit puzzling. But we found some other interesting things that, I think I need to rewait before I delve into. So I think what's kind of interesting with regard to ego dissolution, I think it's a sort of there's more things going on that the ego dissolution experience makes perhaps available, rather than the ego dissolution experience itself being the core thing. So I've been involved with an interesting qualitative study with Dr. David Luke and his PhD student Alex Irvine, and this is a qualitative study. And it's been, one of the more interesting papers or studies I've been involved in, actually. I really like the qualitative approach. I feel like it needs more kind of homage and more kind of application in the psychedelic field. And one of the things that's really interesting about it is, a quantitative or psychometric scale that, say, assesses nature relatedness or nature connectedness. You can show, before, after, and long term, people will complete this scale and you'll get a reading, and that's great. That's good data, but it doesn't tell you how or why people's relationship with nature, their connection to it, is changing. And the qualitative approach does. It provides this depth and this resolution. It honors the human element and leaves that kind of intact, rather than sort of trying to condense experiences into these scales. And we found one of the most, by far, I think the most important factor that sort of seems tied to shifts in people's relationship to nature is the experience of interconnectedness and unity. And I would sort of make the case that they are sort of very much linked. They are another side to the ego dissolution coin, to some degree. I don't want to oversimplify, but it's like the experience of ego dissolution can make available these states of interconnectedness and unity. And what's quite interesting about that is other powerful transformative experiences that humans can undergo. So mystical experiences, both with and without psychedelics, the out-of-body experience, the near-death experience, the overview effect that some of the astronauts report experiencing, planet Earth from space, and interestingly also alien abduction experiences. Interconnectedness is a reoccurring experience that sort of crops up quite reliably among these various different experiences, and it seems also to be linked to the shift in pro-environmental feelings or perspective that can result with all of these. And obviously, more research is required to provide more resolution there, but it seems to be an underlying experiential factor that sort of it links these different experiences and the pro-environmental perspective that can result from them.
Right, and that seems to kind of link back to what you were saying about how we're motivated on a more kind of emotional or visceral level of kind of love for nature, or so if you move into a conception of self where you've seen that actually, or you feel this sense of interconnectedness, interdependence, that you exist through a web of nature, you're not really separate from it. Then if you're doing destruction to something that you feel is part of yourself, then no one needs to tell you not to do that. It feels a very visceral, motivating thing, right?
Yes. That's a good point. And this kind of sentiment is commonly associated with indigenous groups in various parts of the world. There's a study recently published, and it found that sort of areas under the management of or protection of various indigenous groups, such as in Amazonia, they're the only places not undergoing ecological degradation, and in some cases can actually harbor greater biodiversity than protected areas without any humans. And one of the sort of common views shared between these cultures is the perspective that why would you harm willingly your own habitat or environment, because it's just going to reflect back on you, essentially. I had another little point bubbling up then, but I think it's bubbling away.
Back. Yeah. So it's an interesting comparison to where we're currently at with global culture, because we assume there was a time when we all had these kinds of worldviews, and the history of Western civilization that now has defined our global culture has almost been defined by not having that worldview, right?
Yes. that was sort of along the lines of the
It's
point
bubbled back
that
up.
it's bubbling up. Yes, of course. You know, if we kind of rewind the clock, at some point, all humans would have sort of had that kind of way of viewing the world. And I feel like, yeah, as our civilization, our Western civilization has, has progressed, and no one's denying that it has, and it's borne us many amazing and wondrous fruits. But it has, it's gone off on a kind of quite materialistic, individualistic, technological direction. And as it has done, we've drifted and become ever more disconnected from nature. And it's happened in a few sort of different stages and in a few different forms. But as we've become untethered from that and increasingly alienated, it seems that we've lost that innate knowing that if you harm nature and your environment, you essentially harm yourself, which is sort of, obviously quite central to a lot of these indigenous groups who do live very, very connected lives. So that to me is that kind of amnesia is very dangerous and poses a vast existential threat to our species and civilization with where we're going. And we can already see, the kind of the fruits of that in terms of what's happening to biodiversity, to the climate, to the ecosystems that we're impacting.
Right. Yeah, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we both share the same intuition that this almost psychological analysis of what's happened in human culture to lead to the climate crisis, the ecological crisis. It has some kind of psychological roots in our conception of self, and the kind of the picture I've settled on is one of, I feel like as living systems we exist both in this kind of interdependent web of nature, but we also differentiate ourselves and act as individuals, and there's a wise balance of that is what's sustainable. But it seems to me that the trajectory of the kind of dominant culture has been the one centered around separation and control and power. So like technology, right, as a method of controlling nature, agriculture, all of this, it's about, and control is based in fear fundamentally of like, protecting myself, protecting my boundaries. And so this makes sense to me as to why unitive experiences, coming back to realizing that you don't have to be stuck in trauma and in fear and ruled kind of unconsciously by these fear dynamics. It makes sense to me that all of this would go together, a healing of trauma with psychedelics, sense of the unitive, sense of connection with nature, overcoming fear of death, and not being ruled by fear so much in general. Does that sound like a plausible picture as to what might be going on here?
Yeah, I think that's interesting. No, I do think the loss of fear, and it's interesting you say that about the issue of wanting to control, and like certainly it's a very human trait, particularly in working in the field of ecology conservation here in the UK, and like we really like to manage and manicure nature and bend it to our whims, and the idea of like not doing that and just letting nature kind of do it itself is quite an alien and threatening concept to quite a few people. But it's interesting, isn't it, that I think to sort of gain some of the good stuff, if you like, from psychedelics, for them to sort of to bear fruit, you have to kind of be able to surrender control to the experience. That's one of the predictors of positive or mystical type experiences, is the ability to sort of let go of your prior kind of expectations and judgments, and your desire to sort of control the experience as it unfolds, and just sort of let it unfold as it will, and accept it as well, without trying to sort of bend it to one's whims. So that's interesting in terms of the dance between control and fear. is that, yeah, to give up a bit of control can actually help you overcome fear,
Right.
potentially.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me. I mean, since a young age, I've been kind of fascinated by this narrative of our separation from nature, because it seems to me deeply unscientific and deeply kind of that it must be being motivated by something irrational, something
Mm,
unconscious. And I have very vivid memories of being my kind of being at school, which was a Catholic school, where you're getting all this kind of, and just in the general culture, you're given the impression that humans are separate from nature, that we're different
yeah,
somehow, whether it's through explicit teachings on the soul or whatever. But I feel like generally the way we talk about our society, you get that impression. And I have two vivid memories. One of when I first learned that we were animals in a biology class
yeah,
in a religious school, and the teacher almost said it with a smile, like, "I know, isn't it weird?" Like as if there was some acknowledgement of the kind of the inconsistency in the worldview. You know, in one class you're being told we're fundamentally separate, and then you're being told actually we're animals and part of nature. And then also when I learned that plants were alive, like I have again a vivid memory of like, you know, our culture tends to think of them just as background inert scenery, and then suddenly
yeah,
that memory of yeah, they're basically our cousins, just being this mind-blowing thing. And so yeah,
yeah.
it seems to me deeply unscientific to kind of have this worldview.
I feel like it's quite the issue with it is it's quite deeply ingrained, I
Mm.
think, and this is perhaps why where psychedelics can be useful actually in terms of as deconditioning kind of agents, because you know if we go way back, I think the first step away we took from nature was the shift from being hunter gatherers to farming. And obviously I'm not having a go at that. Obviously, like it's we can feed all these billions of people on the planet, and but it was a shift in how you viewed nature. It was more like nature became more of a kind of resource and something a bit more kind of extractive, like you'd be wanting to kind of control your area of habitat to maximize the potential of certain species you favored and exclude those species, or actively kill them, that would like compete for those resources. And before, the hunter gathering approach was it was quite different. You'd only really take what you needed, and it was a more sort of kind of ecologically balanced way of operating. Obviously, not really fit to sort of support a global population of 7+ billion people, but that was the first kind of step away. I do think the Abrahamic religions have a fair bit to answer here for as well. And we've seen the Bible in the book of Genesis. It kind of lays out that humans are special. They're elevated beyond the rest of nature, made in God's image, and God sort of created the herbs and the beasts, to basically for us to do as we see fit with. And that, I feel, that created this sort of this disconnect, that we're not animals, we're special beings, and we can use the animals and the plants however we want. That's not a particularly ecologically well-grounded view to have, or particularly like mentally healthy view to have, I would argue. And then if you think, okay, well, but then comes in Rene Descartes, who sort of, some of his kind of early insights, essentially they laid out the groundwork for the modern scientific method. And one of his sort of insights that kind of sort of became orthodoxy after that was the split between mind and matter, and that once again animals were sort of like, although they seemed to react to pain, it was a kind of, they were essentially like automatons that were just sort of reacting to stimulus, like they any flickerings of what seemed like emotion or anything relating to mind was purely illusionary. Humans are elevated, are the only beings with mind. So yeah, even early science and early scientific thinking was also arguably polluted by this same way of viewing things. So I feel like, yeah, it's sort of, yeah, there's still some kind of lingering relic thinking going on that sort of, I guess, kind of partly was rooted in that, and we've yet to uproot that kind of way of viewing things.
Yeah, and as a scientist, I'm particularly interested in the last point you made. I completely agree with that kind of diagnosis. And the when you look at the origins of science, it's. I mean, I was talking earlier about control, and the ability to accurately model and understand the world gives you a lot of control, right? And so that's partly why science and technology are bound up with each other. And Descartes was, rose to popularity during the Dutch Golden Age, where we're talking about kind of colonialism and conquest and plundering the earth and the makings of modern capitalism. Like it was exactly the right story to become popular at the time, right? If you ask like why did these narratives fit? Who did they did they serve the system? It makes sense, and I think even a few years earlier, a few hundred previous centuries, animism, the idea that kind of nature is like us is alive, was fairly popular in Europe, it seems. And so it's quite a recent shift into this thing of like, everything apart from the human soul is inert, dead matter that we can do whatever we want with.
Yeah. No, I think that's a good point. And it seemed obviously, the animistic view that's obviously deeply tied to shamanism as well, which is essentially a transcultural, pan-global thing. It's independent. It's a view. It's a perspective, kind of shared independently of different cultures in various different times and separated in different parts of the world would have similar sort of views on things. And I guess you could make a case against it not being valid on some level, but it's certainly in some respects more holistic than the kind of more Abrahamic views on nature and how we relate to it.
Right, and in that timeline, there's one other part that I find really interesting in between the agriculture and the Abrahamic religions, which is the when the Indo-European people kind of spread through from northern India, through to kind of Western Europe, and then from them you get the kind of the Celts all the way to the kind of Vedic, Sanskrit writing Indians, and that culture brought with it, all of these cultures have the same concept of a sky father god as opposed to a kind of earth mother. So it seems like kind of European culture before this kind of mass invasion was potentially more holistic, more connected to the earth, more about cyclical rebirth, all the unitive stuff, interconnection, horizontal dynamics. And then suddenly you have this kind of idolization of kind of domination. It's vertical because it's the sky father. It's like transcendent and dissociated. I find this topic fascinating. That's something that I stumbled across that I think doesn't get spoken about very much, but seems like an interesting step.
Interesting. No, that is interesting. Yeah, it seems like there's quite a lot going on here. And I also wonder as well, obviously, because all the major world religions, they kind of have their roots in mysticism, essentially. Like a certain amount of prophets who we now revere, consider saints. Had these powerful mystical, experiences, and obviously part of those mystical experiences, although they can take a wide spectrum of forms, and I certainly wouldn't want to like pigeonhole them and sort of oversimplify them, but it seems that the unitive state, or the state of interconnectedness, appears to be fairly central to the mystical and other transcendental experiences. And obviously, as kind of religion developed, the direct experience of divinity or spirituality, that kind of went away, and instead you would approach an intermediary like a priest or a vicar or a rabbi, or I wonder about the kind of the psychological implications of that once there was the loss of that direct experience. That's going to potentially have its own implications.
Right. Definitely, yeah. That also fits with this narrative of moving towards more centralization, control, hierarchy. You get hierarchies of spirituality with the priests gatekeeping, and and on the issue of science, I think it's, so in my academic work, I've been arguing that I think we can understand consciousness best as a feature of the life process. And obviously in creatures like us, the brain is an absolutely crucial part of that. But
Yeah.
I do think it totally makes sense to think of what, I don't think there's anything magical about nervous systems. I think if you go down to simpler animals that don't have them, that you can still think of them having awareness of their environment
Yeah.
through their embodied action.
Kind of.
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
but this at the moment is seen as kind of there's a kind of an orthodoxy around humans. We know humans are conscious, and then there's this kind of miserly reluctance to grant other creatures consciousness, and we have to gradually, cautiously expanding it. Okay, maybe my dog is conscious. And these are philosophical debates that were happening in the 90s, whereas now most people are comfortable with the idea of other mammals being conscious, but there's still like insects people are unsure about. Is this general vibe. So to me, I feel like it's really just these last few hundred years that we have this strange human exceptionalism. And any other time in human history, it would have seemed deeply intuitive to people that we are other living systems are more like us than we might realize, because we're all part of the same natural process of life. So it seems like we still have this kind of irrational belief functioning in the background throughout all of our culture, and our economic systems, but also scientifically.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. And I feel like for our kind of longer term future on this planet, we really, hopefully we can shift out of this mindset of human exceptionalism, being on top of the pyramid and being masters of the of all. Like, I feel like that sort of to move ahead and have a hopeful future for ourselves, for life on this planet, we do need to sort of have a slightly less ego led. And I mean ego as in like, the collective ego, right. I guess, rather than the individual. That needs sort of damping down, and that will be good for us. I feel like both ecologically but also psychologically as well, to sort of like feel that we're part of a connected greater whole, because that's what humans are wired for. Ultimately, we are social creatures that are wired for connection on a kind of broad domain, both to self, to other people, and to nature world at large. As my friend Dr. Osrotz, through her qualitative research with psilocybin for depression, she found like independently all the people experiencing psilocybin for depression, they reported this shift from a state of disconnectedness on a broad sense to one of greater connectedness. And I feel that we've sort of, obviously, again, in indigenous groups and, like other cultures, they tend to live much more connected lives to both to nature, but also to their community, be it their tribe or their family group. And, our sort of more Western approach, we've sort of, I guess, tried to partly fill that, the lack of connection that increasingly more of us feel through material objects and materialism and consumerism. And it's like, that's a very, 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 very recent development, really. And I don't feel like our brains, we have the brains of our Paleolithic ancestors, essentially. Like, yes, they're very adaptable. I would argue so adaptable that it can be maladaptive. But we are essentially, we're wired for connection, rather than consumerism and material things. And I feel like that's something that's been kind of eroded with our civilization, and we maybe need to try and nurture and nourish that more for a sort of a hopefully better future.
Right. Yeah, I think I've been quite excited recently about these emerging conversations in the area of ecological economics, where, which, as a concept, when you put it alongside neoclassical economics, the main prevailing system that doesn't factor in the environment, with ecological economics, you're considering the Earth as a thermodynamic system and energy consumption, and then the economy as a subpart of that, which to me just seems sane. It's like to build in those assumptions into your models instead
Yeah.
of pretending they don't exist. But then within that,
Yeah.
you have this degrowth movement, the idea that we need to kind of move from this, as you say, like an economy that's based around consumption and just this kind of ever increasing race towards extracting more and more.
Yeah.
And the flip side of that is it's not like we do less of that and we do nothing else. The idea is we build in connection, we spend more of our time in community, caring for each other, and to people. To people like me, that sounds like a much better world that I'd rather live in. There may be fewer material goods, but I think once you've felt the nourishment of connection to yourself, to nature, to others, it's very clear that, as you say, that's kind of an innate part of our programming, and that's what we really want. And material things seem like a kind of a poor substitute for that.
I mean, I think so. It's also it's definitely one of the reoccurring insights from these big transformative experiences that people undergo. And I'm thinking here not only like the psychedelic experience, but also things like the near-death experience, the out-of-body experiences. The kind of the insight that the material. I don't want to kind of slag off material things too much, because I appreciate that we're talking on a computer now. That's a great bit of technology that allows this conversation to happen. There's a lot of material things I'm really grateful for and are really useful and have enriched my life. But it's like, to some extent, people have the insight that the material is immaterial. And there's this sort of fairly reliable shift that people who've had these big experiences seem to go through, and it relates much more obviously to sort of being more aware, sensitive and appreciative of nature, but more wanting to prioritize spending time with friends and family and loved ones, and making time. And if there's they've got the choice, say, of a higher earning job that will give them less time to spend with those people, or a lower income job that gives them more time, they'll probably preferentially go for the latter option. So there's this kind of assessment of one's life values and priorities that can occur in the wake of these experiences. And and it seems that while some people there can be struggles, particularly after something really profound, like a heavy duty near-death experience is a very, it's a very powerful experience to undergo. And people tend to sort of expand in their appreciation for people to the point where their sort of relate partners can become quite threatened, because they're no longer the sort of the main focus. And so it can result in divorces and career change and all this. Potentially, wouldn't go far to say traumatic, but challenging life changes can result from some of these insights and these reappraisals and readjustments of priorities and values.
Right. And so in your work you've been showing that classical psychedelics promote this nature relatedness. And do you think, in the context of the climate crisis and ecological destruction, that could also, I think that growth in general is often a challenging process, and if you're moving towards the things that make you uncomfortable, that's kind of what it feels like to grow. You don't really grow by just staying where you're comfortable. But do you think there's something going on here with exactly, that you might, that by becoming more connected to nature, there can actually be some more personal it's not all like, oh, you become connected to nature and you'll feel completely happy all the time and you won't feel any kind of grief or stress around the ecological situation, but it's a slightly more complex picture than that.
It is, and it's an important point to make. So certainly there's a really quite robust body of research literature showing that nature connectedness or nature relatedness which is essentially the same thing, just different names for the different scales used to assess them. They're robustly associated with good mental health outcomes or measures, particularly relating to eudaimonic well-being and things like vitality. But it's interesting, one study, sort of with a good sample size, it sort of tried to see what things, positive or negative, psychologically, is nature relatedness tied to. And it found overall nature relatedness is associated with good mental and physical health, which obviously, that's nice to hear. But and there is a but, like one particular domain of the nature relatedness scale that was used, which was like which is kind of assessing the degree to which you see yourself as part of nature. So the self as nature, which is a subdomain of this particular nature relatedness scale. And what it found was that people who rate higher in this particular dimension of this scale of self as part of nature sometimes reported higher rates of anxiety and depression. And it wasn't like 100% clear what was sort of being tied to that, but the research in the paper suspected it was people becoming more aware of human cause ecological damage and destruction, and because they were more aware of that, they were more sensitive to that. There's definitely, I think, when awareness grows in this area, there's definitely the potential for uncomfortable feelings and pain. But I mean, there's an interesting, and bear in mind, this is a single one-off case account. So this isn't proper scientific data. But I was on this documentary called Psychedelics, Nature in the Summertime, by one of the people behind the Horizons Psychedelic Conference in New York. And there was a really interesting person featured in the documentary, and she is an environmental scientist who works in the States, and she maps Amazonian rainforest deforestation. And as a result of her work, she developed like high levels of eco-anxiety, and then this blossomed then into major depression, and it was really denting her mental health, seeing the scale of the human destruction of the Amazon rainforest. And she heard about the psilocybin depression trials happening at Johns Hopkins at the time, and her boyfriend said that she's the last person that would ever voluntarily trip, basically. But she was like, we'll have a psychedelic session, but she was like, I'm kind of at my wit's end. I'm up for it. I'm going to be well looked after and supported. So she had this session, and it was interesting sort of hearing her sort of take on it. So like, I think the experience started with her kind of like, she was floating through this rainforest environment, and she said it was like she was totally connected to the wider ecology of where she was. But then as experience continued to kind of unfold and shift, she said she had this perspective of being way up in space, and having the kind of insight that what is happening on planet Earth right now is the tiniest cosmic blip in terms of both time and space. And sort of with that, she felt like the burden of what she'd been carrying on her shoulders personally kind of lifted. It didn't make her any less passionate about her work, and it didn't make her want to stop doing her work, but she just wasn't, I guess, taking it so personally, and it gave her this sense of equanimity and peace, which she'd not had before. So she was able to sort of carry on doing the work she was doing without being kind of really buoyed down by it. So I feel like psychedelics are quite interesting agents when it comes to sort of, nature connectedness, but also potentially eco-anxiety and things like this. And we've not really scratched the surface yet.
Right. Yeah. I mean, because also psychedelics have been shown to promote kind of acceptance, right? Which sounds like what you're talking about.
Yes. Yes. And that seems to be, an important part of their therapeutic effect, actually. Another thing that was found by my friend Ross Watts, who then sort of calibrated it or renamed it as a form of connectedness. But yes, this ability to kind of accept unpleasant emotions, or that you would otherwise maybe try and like numb or ignore or push to the side. And that seems, as you're saying about growth, kind of experiencing those emotions and what the underlying factors that are tied to them is
Right.
is important for that.
Yeah. I mean, for me, the that perspective resonates. I feel like in the world's wisdom traditions, that one of the things that resonate, I think, is most kind of important is the kind of insight around the absolute non-attached perspective of things are just going to go the way they're going to go. Planet Earth is just a small blip in the history of the universe. So not getting stuck in your small scale, attachments and seeing the bigger picture, but also the fact that equally as real as that is that from a relative perspective, you care about what you care about. As a human, I'm attached to other humans and I care about things, and so both of those things are equally true. And there's no final standpoint, no final perspective where you say this is my one perspective. You kind of just have to hold both at different times and oscillate between the two. And so for me, like I feel like as I look at, I think it's absolutely worth doing everything we can to try and avoid ecological devastation. I also feel like things will probably get pretty bad. Like I can't see how they're not going to get pretty bad. But I feel the ability to hold that with this sense of, on the one hand, it's like, well, nature will always survive. Like, you can zoom out and no matter what we do, the planet will rebalance itself, which is a very zoomed out, almost kind of non-human, like identifying with life rather than humans. But then also, after I think that, I immediately then think, well, but imagine the countless number of humans are going to be caught in utterly visceral, devastating, traumatic climate catastrophes, and then that's deeply motivating and moving to me. And I think because of the spaciousness of the non-attached, it doesn't have to go my preferred way. It's going to go the way it's going to go. That spaciousness gives me the feeling that I don't get overwhelmed by the relative suffering. I feel better able to hold it. Whereas I think if I didn't have the spaciousness of the non-attached thing, it would just be like, oh my God, I can't even think about that. It's too painful to think about. So you just would distract yourself, right? So to me, it seems psychedelics can really, because it's easy to live in the relative level, but psychedelics can really take us into this more absolute perspective, and then learning that it's okay to have these two different, or it's wise, I think, to have these two different viewpoints.
No, I think that's an interesting, I kind of like that, the switching between the two different modes of viewing there. And I mean, I don't want to get, come across as evangelical, because I feel like I've, working in ecology, I've got a fairly good handle on the scale of the problem that we face. And I don't think there's like a magic bullet or a panacea or anything single-handedly is sufficient to kind of really effectively push back against both our disconnection from nature, but the environmental crisis that sort of maybe has its root in that, or is results from that. And I feel like there are a variety of different approaches that could be important here, like more nature-based education, natural history being taught in schools, more like biophilic design of cities. So, rather than having urban environments and rural environments where the nature is, it doesn't need to be like that. And we could actually have cities that are much more nature rich, and that would be of huge societal benefit. The reintroduction of locally extinct species, biodiversity enhancement, ecological restoration, increasing public access to nature. There's huge inequalities in the UK about who can access nature depending on where they live. So sort of trying to kind of, there's a few different important fronts to sort of that can be, pursued, I think. I mean, what's interesting to me is having, delved into the nature connectedness literature quite well and looking at different interventions, things like nature immersion or wilderness retreats, nature-based educational programs, engagement programs that encourage daily nature contact in an active way. All these things, that some of them are good. They can elicit significant increases in nature connectedness. Like evidence for long-term shifts is definitely a bit more patchy, I would say, and I'm all about the long-term view personally when it comes to something like this. And this is why actually psychedelics I think are really interesting, because it does seem, bearing in mind there's only been a few preliminary studies and we need more research, but they do seem to show that this shift in people's relationship to nature or their connection to it is pretty enduring, and it can occur even after a single session. But I think what's particularly compelling about psychedelics is they have this capacity to increase people's connection to nature or change their relationship to it, even when they're administered in sort of clinical settings lacking in nature. And that's distinct from all those other nature connectedness interventions I mentioned. Unsurprisingly, they all kind of tend to take place in nature. Nature is very much the sort of the central focus. But you can give someone a dose of psilocybin, say, without any prior intentionality of changing their relationship to nature. And you can give it to them when they're in an environment where the only other, like, if we're describing nature as like, living, nature can be described quite broadly, like for the total sum of everything in the universe. But in this sense, I guess I mean anything that's living. So in a clinical setting, the only other nature there might be other human beings, potentially. You're the therapist guys that are present. There might be some artwork or some photos or something like that of nature. But the fact that these shifts can reliably occur in spite of the setting and without the prior intentionality, and the fact that these shifts can be sustained, that to me is really interesting and quite mysterious. And what's going on there? How is that occurring? Are people, when they have a big dose of a psychedelic, they're maybe tuning into their own internal nature, in the sense they're tuning into the architecture of their brain or their retinal system, and so it doesn't really matter where you are, because we are obviously nature, even if we might have varying levels of amnesia of that. So it doesn't matter whether you connect outwards or connect inwards. It's nature all the way down, or in or out, or perhaps there's this boundary dissolving experience of tied to the ego dissolution, the experience of interconnectedness. So it actually doesn't matter where you are to have that experience, because all the boundaries are going to come down anyway. So a brick wall between you and the natural world isn't going to make any difference really in that state. I mean, I don't know. It's an interesting topic, I think.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you said, maybe it's as simple as, you are obviously nature. And I'm inclined to think that it's kind of, it's like an active delusion that we culturally perpetuate the idea that we're not part of nature. And then as soon as you kind of chemically take offline some of those, or reduce the attachment to those beliefs, there's just this like, oh, of course, it's a continuous unfolding thing that we call the natural world. What else could it be? And, I think that's also when people get into these kind of Gnostic, a sense of gaining insight. I feel like, yes, a lot of these spiritual insights, they're so obvious and simple that they can't be put into words. And, for someone who's not had one of these experiences, it could sound kind of supernatural, mysterious. Oh, like you got some information downloaded, but it's like, well, no, clearly it's just this. It's this thing that's going on that we call nature, and all this other stuff of like, I'm James in my head and I'm separate to it. Like, that's all the nonsense. That's all the supernatural beliefs.
Yeah, no, it's I like that. I mean, one of the reoccurring questions I get when I give talks and stuff like that is someone might say, which is a totally valid thing to ask, is that is it not just psychedelics acting as a non-specific amplifier? And and I think that the non-specific amplifier view of how psychedelics operate is a pretty good working model, I think, of how they actually work. I don't think it's the whole story. I think psychedelics are too inherently unpredictable for just to be sort of fully fit into that mold. But I think that's a big part of the story. But I would kind of argue, I would counter that with, yeah, but if it's a non-specific amplifier, like we are all nature, so the non-specific amplifying view very much aligns to this. I mean, I'm just thinking now of the kind of first survey study I saw on this topic was by Dr. David Luke, and he gave a presentation at Breaking Convention a few years back. And what was interesting is he had a sample, I think, of 150 people had sort of completed his survey assessing different types of psychedelic and other substances and nature connectedness and also pro-ecological concern. And what was quite interesting was he said 100% of his sample described feeling more connected to nature as a result of their psychedelic experiences. It's sort of, it's a web-based survey study. It's quite interesting to have a 100% sort of positive response. It's not that sort of common, I think, in psychology to get those kind of results, and and that manifested in different ways. So I think I was mentioning earlier, like there's strong evidence to show that nature connectedness is tied to positive mental health, good mental health outcomes. I would say less in the clinical sense, and perhaps more, although there might be something there, more in a sort of healthy living kind of viewpoint. And obviously that can buffer against clinical things like anxiety and depression, but it's more about sort of flourishing, I would say. But there's also this evidence linking nature connectedness to pro-environmental behavior change as well. And people will say, well, if psychedelics can increase nature connectedness, can they actually change behavior? And obviously we need to do more work here to sort of know to what degree psychedelic changes in nature connectedness can predict or result in actual behavior. But it was interesting in David's sample, I think he found up to 16% of his sample, so 50% of his sample had taken up gardening more as a result of their experience, which was quite nice because gardening is fantastic for your mental physical health. Almost all his sample either spent the same amount of time in nature or spent more time in nature. I don't think there was very, very few said that they reported less time in nature as a result of their psychedelics. That alone has important implications because nature contact, is really important for physical mental health. But he also said about 16% of his sample reported career change as a result of their sort of ecological insights. So people, would change careers and shift to something where they were having less of what they felt was less of an overall impact, or more actively positive. And I think he said, interestingly, 3 of his sample had shifted careers and were pursuing PhDs in botany-related subjects as a result of their experiences. So yeah, it's interesting. Obviously this is something like nature connectedness and obviously psychedelics as well. They're very personal and subjective in how they sort of interface with you and result in life change. So it's hard to sort of predict how it might sort of change people's perspectives or their sort of their life trajectory, but potentially these experiences can sometimes.
Right. Yeah, and it's worth pausing on. You mentioned the kind of the health benefits of things like gardening and immersion in nature, and people may be aware that there's this body of literature of just going for a walk in the woods, being immersed in nature, being incredibly good for you in multiple ways. But it's worth just pointing out that when we're talking about nature relatedness or nature connection, this is a kind of conceptual psychological thing, right? It's not that they've actually been out in nature. You could still have someone in a clinical sterile room who's had a psychedelic experience and has this feeling of nature connection and nature relatedness, and they will also
Yes.
have positive improvements in well-being and other associated measures.
Yes, no, that is important to say. So yeah, so nature connectedness is referring, or relatedness is quite specific, and it's also quite complex. It's a multi-dimensional construct, and aspects of um, cognition and personality traits and prior experience with nature, particularly in your childhood, all sort of meld together and synergize to produce this overall construct of nature connectedness. But yeah, it's specifically relating to sort of one's innate love of nature or their feeling of being part of it. Whereas nature contact or nature immersion is simply, yes, contact with nature in different forms. So they are separate, but they kind of interact as well. So people who rate higher in nature connectedness, potentially there's benefits to mood and cognition following from nature contact that they will gain more from. But it's possible, obviously, to be a nature connected person in an otherwise fairly nature lacking environment. But yeah, people who are more connected to nature, and this is maybe what's coming up in David's sample, people who are more connected to nature, unsurprisingly, they place greater value on their relationship with it, and they tend to spend more time outside in nature. So that's kind of got like related but also independently additive benefits to health and well-being.
Right. And in your studies, is it that when people have this increase in nature relatedness, I think I've heard you say that it's like they hadn't realized that they were disconnected from nature before. They kind of discovered that they had been alienated without realizing it.
Yes. So this is really interesting. This actually this cropped up in Ros Watts's qualitative psilocybin study I mentioned earlier. So she did a kind of 6-month follow-up, qualitative follow-up of the first phase 1 psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression trial at Imperial to find out, what people actually experience, how had it sort of shifted things for them. And yeah, it was one of the accounts in that study that I think we reference in the paper we collaborated on together. And yeah, it was someone who reported that they'd sort of they'd not noticed or been aware of their disconnection from nature until after their psychedelic experience, where in some sense they kind of turned on and tuned back into nature. It's like, okay, this is what I was missing. But I don't want to also, a never actually interesting account of one of the participants in that study was that, and I think it's mentioned in the same paper, and this is an important point because it kind of gets across that the nature is great, but it's not a panacea or a magic healing agent. And it was this guy who had the psilocybin session and had sort of gained a lot from it, and this family were really grateful because it was like having their dad of old back, for a time, for a few months, I think. But he kind of, I think they're sort of based around the Scottish borders in the countryside, and I think subsequently to when he kind of dipped back into his depression, he said he was out walking in nature, in the sunshine in the countryside, and he said he felt he didn't feel any connection to it or any enjoyment of it or anything. He just wanted to be in a dark room with the curtains closed in bed. So yeah, nature absolutely, I think, has its place, but it's also sort of like it's only got a certain amount of power as well. It's not like the be all and end all, I would say, if that makes sense.
And then in your studies, you mentioned there's a lot of literature out there looking at correlations, but the way you've structured your studies, do you think it's sufficiently shown like that there's a kind of causality here, that it's not just that people who like nature are more likely to take psychedelics, but the psychedelics actually produce the effect?
Yeah, so this is interesting. I was having this conversation with a friend actually just over the weekend, and I feel like there's a two-way interaction going on here. It's not just that. Certainly, I think there's evidence, like admittedly limited evidence, and we need for follow-up studies. And there are follow-up studies being done that I'm involved in, and hopefully there will be more data and evidence sort of presented fairly soon. But it seems that yes, psychedelics can definitely increase prospectively, before and after and long term, they can increase nature connectedness or nature relatedness. But what's been quite interesting, I've been involved with a study looking at nature relatedness in the context of a Shipibo-led indigenous Amazonian ayahuasca retreat in the Peruvian Amazon. And it's an interesting context because you've got the Amazonian rainforest, which is like one of the centers for global biodiversity. You've got the indigenous shamanic context, which is very much nature themed and referenced, lots of kind of references in the shamanic philosophy of the interconnection of humans and nature. So you've got those sort of factors going on. But what was quite interesting was that our sample, and they varied. Some of them had no prior psychedelic use, and some of them a little bit, and some of them a bit more. But their baseline levels of nature relatedness were already suspiciously high. And I think we've also noted that in the survey study I was involved in with Imperial, like compared to some other samples that were listed detailed in some of the literature, our starting baseline levels of nature relatedness did seem to be suspiciously high. So it does seem perhaps that kind of more nature interested or kind of like people tend to sort of be drawn to psychedelics. But I'm not sure. There could be a few potential factors going on here. For instance, personality trait openness to experience is a primary psychological predictor of nature connectedness, that's associated with nature connectedness. And people who are more open to new experiences are likely going to be more open to ingesting psychedelics in the first place. So there is a bit of a kind of two-way interaction, I think, going on there.
Right. And is there another interaction with the openness where psychedelics increase openness, and openness is also associated with nature relatedness? So if you take a psychedelic, that may also produce greater nature relatedness.
So it's very possible. It's hard to kind of exactly pinpoint, particularly because these things tend to be correlations, like how much is sort of influencing what exactly. And there could be, so with the psilocybin study that I mentioned that I've been involved in, and I can't say too much because it's not yet been sort of submitted and gone through peer review, but we found quite a strong correlation or connection between nature relatedness increase and shifts in people's trait absorption, which was quite unexpected, but interesting, because absorption, your ability to be engrossed in mental phenomena, and that could be internal, but it can also be external, is tied to sort of people who rate higher in absorption may be more prone to sort of being engrossed by and interested in nature. And we know from previous research, like openness can be increased. Absorption is very much associated with openness. It used to be considered the same, and then it was sort of like, kind of designated its own thing because it had its own sort of properties. But it's also been shown that absorption can be increased in a sustained way, well, for at least a month post psilocybin session in some previous study. So it seems that this kind of shift is also perhaps important for nature connectedness. But yes, that's definitely strongly related to openness and kind of overlapping with it.
Right. And you mentioned ayahuasca and psilocybin. Are there any particular substances that have more of an effect on nature relatedness than other ones?
So yeah, it's an interesting question. So there's a few things sort of actively going on here. So David Luke's survey study I've mentioned a few times actually. He looked at the various different psychedelics and other substances as well, like MDMA and ketamine and cannabis, iboga, as well as the usual suspects, the classical psychedelics like LSD, psilocybin, mescaline, and stuff. And he found in that particular sample, psilocybin mushrooms were definitely top of the pile. Ayahuasca and LSD were not that far behind, roughly level, but it was psilocybin was interestingly, curiously, seemed to be sort of slightly sort of number one. I'm currently a colleague, collaborator, Matthias Forsman, is working on a paper where I've linked him up with some of my Imperial collaborators, and we've combined independent data sets looking at different psychedelics. So one from one of his studies and one from one of ours, to look at like what difference does type of psychedelic actually make to nature connectedness. So that's it's sort of in the pipeline. The qualitative study that I mentioned that I'm collaborating on with David and his PhD student Alex, they did I think a follow-up survey study, and again they reported particularly that psilocybin seemed to be sort of a particularly powerful nature connector, and that's quite interesting. And the mechanisms of how and why that is exactly are yet to be sort of really explored. And it's an interesting thing as well from David's survey sample, and Matthias Forsman independently found this actually in his work, that dissociative anesthetics such as ketamine seems to go the other way. They seem to be active. They act as active disconnectors and promote a lack of concern, which is quite interesting, I guess, because they have different mechanism of effect, and they're sort of dissociative and they disconnect mind from body. They're sort of so that's quite interesting. But it's something that's quite special and linked to the classical psychedelics. I mean, some people go, well, it's because if you're eating mushrooms, obviously you're going to feel like you're more connected to nature because they're part of nature. And I'm sure the context of that does play a part, but other things like tobacco and cannabis and opium and deliriants and various different plant drug, fly agaric mushrooms, they don't have this particularly robust effect. And what's key, like perhaps some of them might do in the acute experience itself, but what makes the classical psychedelics interesting and sort of unique is this ability to elicit these sustained shifts. So long after the drug effect is waned, people's perspective towards or relationship with nature has shifted and remains so in the cold, sober light of day.
Right. And I know a major theory as to why psilocybin evolved is to do with kind of deterring insects from eating the mushrooms. And with your background in entomology and ecology, I'd love to hear your thoughts on why you think psilocybin might have evolved.
Well, yeah, it's a very interesting question. I nearly tried to write a paper on this to sort of to flesh out and go into detail, because I think it is a fascinating topic. but sort of, and I read around and I was trying to sort of see what evidence is out there. I'm aware of, there is a leafcutter ant that has a symbiotic association with a psilocybe mushroom fungus, and it kind of harvests the some of the mycelium of this particular psilocybe species, which is quite interesting. I mean, I know that in Kew Gardens they did some interesting study with the psilocybe cyanescens mushrooms that grow on site there, and they've got a license to sort of use them and handle them and use them in research. And it's quite a potent mushroom, like gram for gram. And they fed this fungus matter to psilocybin-rich fungus matter to fungus gnats, which are primary fungivores all over the world. And they observed there was no apparent defects or obvious damage or alteration to the life cycle of these fungus gnats and the grubs, the maggots of these gnats that were consuming this psilocybin-rich fungal flesh, which was interesting. So it kind of unless those fungus gnats had already evolved protection from the psilocybin, they had the necessary enzymes to combat it. It seemed to kind of put the kind of insect repellency theory into kind of put it into slight doubt. I know Terence McKenna. So obviously we know psilocybin is a serotonin mimicking agent. That's how it evolved. It evolved to slot into the serotonin receptor. And serotonin is incredibly ancient compound. And it's important to remember, we consider it, although it's in our gut as well, it's a primary neurotransmitter of cognition and the brain, but it has a vast array of different uses and applications in all different forms of life. And serotonin occurs in the fungi themselves, actually. And so it clearly evolved to target serotonin receptors probably in other organisms. It's the genes with which, psilocybin, the ability to manufacture psilocybin it's cropped up independently, apparently, a few times. So it's in a few clades of the higher fungi. It's also, interestingly, actually, maybe get that into a sec. So one of the curious things in the evolution of psilocybin is that it's spread through horizontal genes transfer between quite distantly related genera of fungi. And that's quite unusual. Like, obviously, bacteria are constantly swapping genes around through horizontal genes transfer, and fungi do as well. But the fact that, these different groups of fungi shared this ability to manufacture the blueprints of to sort of manufacture psilocybin, that indirectly infers that there has got to have been an evolutionary advantage to producing it. And there's no such thing as a free lunch. Like the ability to produce psilocybin is otherwise robbing life energy and resources that could go into growth and reproduction. So I feel like it's a mysterious thing. Well, then they found this entomopathic pathogenic fungus that attacks insects, in particularly cicadas, and they found that these two species of fungus, one produces cathinones, like the stimulant found in the chat plant, and the other one, much to the surprise of the scientists doing the research, was that it produced psilocybin. So the fungus invades the body of the cicada, and it produces psilocybin to essentially wrest control of their brains, and it seems to hypersexualize these cicadas. And the males will even mimic being females, and they will sing the female "Come Hither" song, so that they can then just grab males and mate with them, and they will keep mating until their body disintegrates and their abdomen falls away, and there's this plug of basically fruiting body, fungus fruiting body, and they're called salt shakers of death. because they just keep mating even though they're falling apart, and they're spreading all these fungal spores everywhere. So obviously here in that case, the that fungus is wielding the psilocybin as a sort of as a mind control agent for its host. And that's quite interesting if we kind of zoom out for a bit and ponder, I wonder why these fungi are producing psilocybin. So I'm not really sure of its initial use. I mean, maybe it was some kind of deterrent. Evolved about 10 to 20 million years ago. So definitely before our time. Some people get slightly an anthropocentric view that, it was made to get to for us to consume. But now, seeing the way humans react to it, I feel like evolution can repurpose things over time. So just because something appeared on the scene for a specific use, that doesn't mean like a few million years in the future it will be the same. Like different things can sort of play different roles at different times. So now I wonder, when humans have become involved, it's psilocybin's maybe a bit more of an attractant than a deterrent. And because we've obviously we grow these fungi, and we've spread them. You tend to get sort of much of these psilocybe mushrooms, not all of them, but a hefty chunk of them, they thrive in areas of ecological disturbance or human modified habitats. Psilocybe cubensis, Panaeolus mushrooms love cattle pasture and grow on bovine dung. You've got your wood-loving species that grow in areas of ecological damage and disturbance in like forestry type environments, and you've got your pasture mushrooms as well, like Psilocybe semi-lanceata, the old liberty cap, and they thrive in sheep fields and areas of grazed pastures. So a lot of these species, a suspiciously high amount of them, I would almost say, seem to have benefited through human modification of the environment. So it's definitely food for thought, but I don't quite know the full story of what's going on, but it's interesting.
Yeah, that was great. I mean, I think the idea. So I also am concerned sometimes that the thinking can be quite anthropocentric. But having said that, I think you're totally right that with something as ancient as serotonin and its related compounds, it's actually invites us again to realize that ecology, I mentioned, is the fundamental science, in the sense that when we think of the chemistry of these pathways, there's nothing magical inside the molecule itself that does the activity. It's a lock and key mechanism that unlocks a pathway. So
yes,
in a cicada, it could be activating sexual kind of neural circuits. In a different organism, it could be activating something else. Combined with that, we don't have a fossil record for what mushrooms in general, but for what species at what times are repurposing different chemicals. So combined with the horizontal gene transfer, it could be on the timeline of human evolution that these things get spread around. I do find it quite appealing, the idea that, again, when you look at how amazingly resilient and intelligent the evolved behaviors of mushrooms are, when as you're saying, mind controlling insects through to shuffling around nutrients in ecosystems, it doesn't seem theoretically impossible to me that at a certain time it could be evolutionarily beneficial to hack this ego circuit of these apes that have got too much into this mode of control and damaging the environment, and all they have to do is activate this particular serotonin pathway, and lo and behold, the monkeys calm down and stop destroying the environment. And it does seem that as the position of fungi in the ecosystem is seemingly as connectors, right, as kind of decomposing things and repurposing, putting things back into the environment. So if there was a species that was going to do that, I feel like it would be a mushroom. But having said all that, why do we see mescaline having a similar effect in cacti? It's not a catch-all theory for why psychedelics exist. But if psilocybin has a particular effect on taking us into this ecological, unitive, cyclical worldview, it does feel like the worldview of the mushroom, to get a bit out of there. So I don't know. Yeah, I think that no one really knows at this point, right? But it's definitely fun to speculate on.
Yeah. No, definitely. I mean, it is interesting, just to kind of, remember that a lot of these species, and particularly the fungi species, they occur in areas of ecological damage or disturbance, and some of them will actively thrive in those environments. They can, when you consume them, provoke this sort of feeling of connecting to the wider environment, and sort of maybe kindling feelings of stewardship or protection for that. But then also interesting, I learned sort of a little while back that the mycelium of Psilocybe cyanescens, which is an interesting species in this regard because it's a wood-loving species that's done very well through humans in terms of spreading. Like it's thought to be, I think, Pacific Northwest native, but it's definitely here in the UK now, and it's sort of done quite well out of humans before, perhaps occupying quite a niche habitat, but sort of really having its sort of real estate opened up due to forestry work and having lots of wood chips it can feed on. But apparently their mycelium actively breaks down human caused pollutants like PCBs, persistent organic hydrocarbons in the environment. As the mycelium feeds on its woody substrates, it creates free radicals, and they hit the molecules of the PCBs and sort of and break them apart. So it's sort of on kind of multiple levels. They're sort of responding to human inputs and stressors and sort of interfacing with humans in different, quite interesting ways.
I think, I mean, the thing we're speculating about here, you mentioned the insect thing, the idea that you could argue that the effectively people like ourselves who are arguing this is a valuable way to change our beliefs and move towards increased nature relatedness, that would be almost like a brainwashing from the fungal perspective, without it necessarily having to have its own intentional perspective, but just the evolutionary dynamics, the kind of ecological niche that it represents. Like, we're coming to value that over what is our current cultural mode. And that could sound kind of unnerving if we're being brainwashed by this fungus. But I guess my conclusion would be that the mycelium and fungi in general are this incredibly resilient, incredibly ancient and successful organism. And so there's a wisdom there to the fungal perspective, and actually, I'm willing to defer to the fungi and basically say their way of life seems wiser than ours. But of course, I would say that if I was brainwashed by a fungus.
No, that's true. We both wouldn't we? But I feel like we can kind of examine the evidence of like what this shift in perspective, to live a more kind of nature connected and aware existence brings to the table. And it's potentially quite a lot in terms of we know that overall it's definitely better for your mental health and well-being, particularly eudaimonic well-being and general happiness as well. But then also, the implications of potentially living a more environmentally, I wouldn't just say sustainable, but actively regenerative existence as well. It feels like there's multiple fruits to be born by that. So you can question whether is this me thinking this, or am I being fungally brainwashed? But I think if you kind of, in the cold sober light of day, examine the implications of the fungal mediated shift, it holds up. I think it's because it's bringing like measurable, quantifiable benefits to the table, I would say.
Right. Yeah, I would agree. If someone could go to someone else who's not taken psilocybin and say, here's a model for how we could live and it's sustainable, and someone could be convinced by it rationally, that's a pretty good reason to think it's a rational conclusion you're coming to, not some crazy.
That's probably that's a good way of sort of vetting the fungal brainwash insights. Is give it, present them to someone else who's not been fungally brainwashed.
Exactly. So while we're speculating, maybe to end on, I'd be interested to hear what your kind of best case scenario for how, you know, human society could progress in the future using psychedelics as a tool to increase nature relatedness. Yeah, what's your feeling of like what would be the best avenue if things went as well as they could?
Oh wow. So um yeah, God, that's a big old question. So
Yeah, I may be asking you to to go outside of your area of expertise, and you know,
well,
it's okay as well to, you know, I often come down with this thing of like the wisdom of decentralization, where when it gets to a point when we're deciding on a new economic system for the world, like that's not for me to, you know, that's for
yes.
collective wisdom. So don't feel you have to have all
No,
the
no,
answers.
no, that's cool. I mean, part of what kind of has interested me recently, actually, as I mentioned before, there's these, you know, these certain big experiences that people undergo, like the overview effect and out of body experiences, near death experiences, mystical experience, deep psychedelic experiences. And although those seem sort of all quite different, they're actually there's a great deal of overlap between them, not just the acute experience itself, you know, and experiences of awe, unity, interconnectedness are kind of fundamental parts of all of them, but the long-term shifts in values, there's also quite a lot of overlap between them, sort of suggesting that, you know, they're variations on a core transformative human experience. And people, yeah, tend to shift in a certain um, number of ways. And there's this, I guess, there's a shift towards becoming, from being less competitive to more wanting to cooperate with humans. People tend to become less materialistically interested or inclined or motivated. People become more aware of, interested in, connected to nature. People prioritize connection to others, to self, and to the wider world. Um, and yeah, people less probably hung up on, as well as material things, on the pursuit of power and money. And you know, there's this sort of, yeah, those shifts I think are all really quite interesting, because, well, partly they're sort of very much out of alignment with our current operating system in terms of our societal values and priorities, and what society deems important. So there's quite a dissonance really that needs to sort of, but I kind of wonder, as a thought experiment, like, imagine if we constructed um, a civilization or a society that was more built on those values, connectedness and cooperation, ecological, not just sustainability. We're past the point of sustainability now. That it's good. I'm not knocking it, but we need more than that. I would say an actively ecologically regenerative culture. So doing what we can to restore ecosystems and biodiversity. So yeah, I mean, so ideally, if we could, if there's some way of sort of slightly overhauling the current system, and yes, I'll defer to the group wisdom there, because it's definitely beyond me as an individual. But if we could move in a direction of where we're sort of thinking much more holistically, ecologically, as being part of a larger interconnected web, if we're prioritizing ecological sustainability and regeneration, much stricter laws for ecocide and damaging the environment, more emphasis on cultivating connection and cooperation between people, and less emphasis on materiality and pursuit of material things and consumerism, because I don't think actually yeah, it doesn't always make people that happy. So yeah, that would be, yeah, if we could kind of sort of shift in that direction. Perhaps easier said than done. I feel like there's potentially quite a lot of benefits there societally on the big picture, but also the individual. It might lead to to sort of happier people who have more meaning and purpose and potentially joy in their lives. I mean, maybe that's naive and idealistic. Maybe it's not feasible. I don't know, but yeah, that moving, shifting in that general direction is where I would like to see us go, if we can.
Yeah, I completely agree. Well said. I mean, I think as well, when I feel like we're raised to think of societal issues in terms of just theoretical ways we could organize society, and in that context, it's like we think in terms of utopias or imaginary things where everything's perfect, and I don't think that's a wise way to go. But the picture you just sketched out, that I completely agree with, to me, it feels like it kind of recasts our situation as almost as one of health, where I feel like at the moment we're lost. We don't really know what's wrong with us as a civilization. Something's wrong, and we're not. And so, yeah, we've lost our way. And the direction you've just sketched out, I do think it's win-win, or like in terms of, we not only do we survive, physically as a species on a planet that we're destroying, but also we rediscover the things that make us feel connected and whole, and and our mental health improves. I don't think that's naive. I think that's what it would mean to become healthy again and rediscover balance. And in that picture again, there will always be tensions and struggles and challenges. It's not a utopia, but it's a difference from a pathological situation of being lost.
Yeah, I think so. No, I don't think it's a utopia type deal. I feel it's not like a magic cure-all, but I feel like it would be overall a healthier, more hopeful direction to try and head in. And one other thing that comes out of these experiences, which aligns with science, we're both scientists, is people come out of these big experiences and they tend to have this great hunger for knowledge and wanting to learn more and know more. And I feel like that's important. Certainly it's a motivator of my life and gives my life meaning and purpose as well. So I feel like that's one of the values I just want to give a quick shout out to.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate what you're doing, and I think the thing that is of most consequence at the moment, if we're to put our energy anywhere, raising environmental awareness is probably the most consequential thing. So I very much appreciate the work you're doing.
Thank you, James. I appreciate that, and likewise, I'm glad that you're out there doing your thing as well, and it's good, connecting with peeps that are on their own really interesting paths. But thank you. I mean, I don't think that as I mentioned, that psychedelics can kind of like single-handedly like push us back from the brink. I feel like it's the scale of the issue is too big, but there's a chance that they could help, and I think would be foolish not to look into that at least.
Right, definitely. And so, where can people go if they want to kind of engage with you more?
Well, as I'm on Twitter as we connected on there. Twitter's pretty good. I'm at Samwise Gandy on Twitter, and I've got my ResearchGate profile. If people want to read any of my papers or anything, they're pretty much all open access, and I kind of upload them on there if anyone wants to have a delve. But I need to actually, it's been on my to-do list to kind of get a website or something, but I've not quite got around to it. Probably Twitter really is best bet. And I'll always try and get back in touch with people and stuff if they reach out.
Great. Yeah. And thanks again, Sam. I've really, really enjoyed this.
Cool. No, likewise, James. So have I. Thanks for having me. It was really good to chat.
Thanks for listening. If you're watching on YouTube, please like and subscribe. And if you want to help the podcast reach a wider audience, you can leave a review on Apple Podcasts. Finally, if you want to offer financial support, you can go to patreon.com/Dr. James Cook.